My name's Gabriella Matson, and I was born in Tucson, Arizona, back in '82. It wasn't until we moved to Whidbey Island, that was the first place I was told I was poor, and the first place that started to really define who I was, my sexual orientation, and my personality.
Hear Gabby's story about transformation, facial feminization, gender identity disorder, and what was the hardest thing about her journey.
Hi, I'm Dr. Philip Young, and I'm an award-winning beauty theorist and facial plastic surgeon from Aesthetic Facial Body Plastic Surgery. And we're the Beauty Docs on YouTube.
My name's Gabriella Matson, and I was born in Tucson, Arizona, back in '82. I was born after the FAA strike, and my dad was an air traffic controller, and we moved shortly thereafter to Oklahoma, where I lived until I was about 7, when my dad got a job at Boeing, and that moved us up here to Washington. When I was younger, I was 7 when we moved up here. I just completed first grade, and we moved from a farm to a suburban environment. It was very different, but I was also a young kid. All of a sudden, there were a lot of people that were my age to play with. I could bicycle to school, and it wasn't until we moved to Whidbey Island at the end of 3rd grade that I started to realize that there were differences between what I'd been used to in Oklahoma, or even living in Marysville, Washington, and what I was surrounded with now. And that was a little shell-shocking. That was the first place I was told I was poor, and the first place that started to really define who I was, my sexual orientation, and my personality. So when it first started, I didn't know I was different. I was very confused as to why I couldn't grow up to be a little girl, because other people got to grow up to be little girls. It's one of the beautiful things about being 7. You can form whatever reality you want. And I remember one day when we were in Oklahoma, we were at the Sears store, and we were picking out winter coats. It was late summer. They were going to be put on layaway, and we all got to pick our coats, as parents generally let their small children pick out. Being that my mother had everything picked out, but we were getting to participate. And I pointed to this pink coat with green polka dots and really confused the gentleman behind the counter, because here was this boy that just picked out a girl's coat. But there wasn't anything that I knew was really different until I was in 4th grade, when we really started segregating ourselves based off masculinity and femininity, and I didn't fit. And that kind of set the pretext for the rest of my schooling. It got to a point where I was excluded because I was feminine. But if I attempted to be masculine, I was penalized for it because I could barely ape being masculine. So I set into a standard just being myself, which is really, really outside the norm for transgender women I've met. Transgender women I've met have generally latched on to the hypermasculinity, where I just accepted that I was feminine, and that was the role I was allowed to play. It's something you see more in transgender children today. So I went about my life. I joined the Marine Corps, did a tour in Iraq, came back, joined the Army, did another tour in Iraq, came back, and really entered the civilian world at that point. It was 2007. And in 2008, I returned to Whidbey Island, and my roommate at the time, we lived together for a couple months before we moved to Whidbey. We were unpacking all of our boxes and getting everything put in our rooms and such, and she came in and she said, "You know, if you want to be a girl, you can be." And I was kind of confused because I'd lived most of my life with the understanding that I couldn't be, that I was a boy, and it was just something that I accepted. And I hadn't heard about or known anything about transgender community. I think the closest that I had gotten besides parodies and comedy sketches was Rocky Horror Picture Show, and even then that was theater, that wasn't real. So this idea that there were these people like me never really crossed my mind. And that started a long journey in trying to learn about what being transgender meant, what was out there, if it even rang true for me. And when I was 30, I decided that not only was it something that was true for me, but it was something that I needed to do. I needed to transition. I'd fallen into employment where, working with team after team, it was just like middle school again, just like grade school and high school, where we segregated based off gender, and I didn't fit those norms. So I started my journey there, and it wasn't until August 2015 when I was 33. So 3 years after I started my journey that I told my father. And it was a really important thing for me because my father at that point in time was the only member of my family I actively communicated with, or that I wanted in my life. I have two brothers. I have my mother. My mother and I, we don't talk for other reasons, and I was never close to my brothers. But my father was the one who taught me how to bake and taught me how to weld and sew and build furniture, and was the one that was always supportive of everything I did. So I held off actually physically, chemically transitioning until I let him know. So on a Sunday in August 2015, I went to his house on Whidbey and we talked about it, and he was actually relieved. I have a bad habit of showing up and saying, "Hey, I'm deploying," and he's a Vietnam vet. He got out right after Tet in '68, and both his brothers were drafted. He knew what that meant to go to war. He knew what yellow envelopes meant, that he'd lost a child. And to him, transitioning wasn't an issue. It was something that I needed to do, and like anything else in my life, he supported me at that. So the next person I told was my little brother. I said we didn't have a big relationship, but they had their 3 kids, and Howard started to actively bug me about when I was going to see my nieces and my nephew. And I was on the phone with him, and I called him because my dad needed to talk to him, but my dad didn't have his number on his cell phone, and we were together, so I just called him up and I said, "You know how you keep asking me to come out to upstate New York?" And he's like, "Yeah. Would you be upset if your kids had an aunt instead of an uncle?" And he said, "No, as long as you're happy, it's perfectly fine." And that's kind of how I came out to my little brother. I didn't tell my mother until last week, until this is November 2016. And I told her answering machine. Like I said, my mother and I, we don't talk. And I wanted to tell my older brother. And he is learning disabled, and it's always been a kind of a touchy thing of how to introduce it to him. So I told my mother because I wanted to tell my older brother. And I told her answering machine, and I left it at that. And then my dad told my older brother for me. And he got really, really upset because from what he saw in the media, what he saw on TV, what he saw in the news, and what he saw on how people talked, he thought this meant that I wouldn't have friends anymore, that everyone I knew would leave me, and that, people would want to hurt me for being me. And that upset him because I'm his sister, and big brothers do tend to be protective of their sister. But yeah, so it's very important. One of the reasons I held off for so long was I didn't think that I would look like a cisgendered woman, like a person born and assigned female at birth. I thought I was too tall. I thought my shoulders were too broad. I just didn't think that it was something that could be done. And I remember this woman was walking up the stairs at the Gold's Gym on Capitol Hill in Seattle to the mezzanine, and I was coming down, and here was a woman who was my height, my build, my general body type. And I mean, we all have these stereotypes of how people should look in our minds, and they're driven by culture and society and the media and such. And I just had this, and my mother was very petite. She's 5'2", 90 pounds. So I had this view and I didn't know I had it, of very petite women. Once I realized it was something that I could do, I wanted to make sure that I not only I wanted my inside and my outside to match. I was a pretty boy, I've been told, and I wanted to carry that over. And that meant looking for a plastic surgeon who could take care of that, and who understood that it wasn't because there are surgeons that have their own vision, that work with transgendered persons, but not that had their own vision, but who could respect mine, and understood that it was more about minor tweaks than major changes, major revisions. Which just it kept all those kind of natural features, so people saw that it was still me. And quite honestly, if you put pictures side by side of me before and after, there have been people who thought we were twins, which was very much what I was going for. I was going for a very natural look, a look that maintained a lot of the features that were predominant in my family. So the facial work I had was very limited. It was a rhinoplasty, and it was a chin reduction. And I remember the day I brought the picture in that had the nose that I wanted, and how excited I was. It was scary. I mean, I'd had oral surgery before. I'd been put under general anesthesia before. But this was something major. This was cutting into my face. This was changing a lot of facial features. And even though we planned, we didn't know what the results would be, because, swelling goes down and things start to settle in, and you know, it becomes what it is. But I remember the first time the swelling had reduced and my nose started to show through, and how happy that made me. And just knowing that, I mean, it was, I sent Dr. Young a photo. I think it was at like 4:30 in the morning, excited about my nose and my chin, and that the scarring was hid. And I think one of the one of the most validating points of it all was I had the surgery in September, and I'd spent about 90 days over the holidays out of work on a leave of absence, and I got back in, and one of my coworkers she'd had cheek implants and a chin reduction and her jaw reset and nose, and she looked at my face and she knew exactly what I'd had because we talked about it before. And she was jealous that the scarring was non-existent and that everything looked so natural. And I said earlier that I was told that I was pretty as a boy, and that was the first time I started seeing myself as pretty. It was the first time in my life that I could look in a mirror and recognize who was looking back at me. That was kind of scary too, because the first time that you look in a mirror and you understand what other people see when they look at you, and you see yourself as beautiful, it's a wonderful thing. It's definitely been the HRT. One of the joys of doing hormone replacement therapy, whether you're male transitioning to female or female transitioning to male, is HRT, because we all went through puberty. And with the exception of the kids today who are lucky enough to have hormone blockers and to transition as they grow up, we all went through puberty. And here I was 33 years old, and I was going through puberty again. And oh my God, was that a bit traumatizing. I thought that because I was going into it understanding a little more than I did when I was originally 12, what it was like. And it wasn't. I had 2 combat tours, which equaled out to about 30 months in country, and there was PTSD that I'd been able to sort of deal with for nearly 10 years. There was just the trauma of how I was treated by my peers, and there was a lot of emotion that had been kept in check, and HRT just induces all of these hormones, and it's an art. It is really an art, because people's bodies absorb at different rates, and mine refused to absorb estrogen at anywhere near a decent rate. My levels were all over the board, and so was my behavior. I I had my therapist, and she wasn't joking about it, diagnosed me as being an angsty 12-year-old tween going through puberty without adult supervision, which my friends thought was hilarious because they'd said the same thing months before. But yeah, definitely the HRT is the worst part and the best part. I mean, it changes your body and it changes a lot of how people perceive you. But oh my God, you think you know what's going to happen and you don't. It just does. I'm a bit of a unicorn. But I was, even when I was in the service and deployed, and I'm still in the service, my teammates, they treated me like I was their little sister. Like I said, I never hypermasculinized, so there wasn't a lot of external change in how I acted, and I think the hardest part wasn't accepting the idea that I wasn't masculine or I wasn't a man, because I don't think I ever really accepted that. And it's happened a couple times, but it's the realization that my worldview hasn't changed, the way I act hasn't changed. And even though I was fairly accepting of what I was, I still kind of expected this change to occur. And it didn't, and it made me always wonder, well, not always wonder, but at those moments, it made me wonder if I'd done the right thing. I mean, it instilled this bit of self-doubt because nothing had changed. And I think for people who are going through this, whether you hypermasculinize or not, dealing with that concept that some parts of your worldview aren't going to change. Though you're still going to see things the way you see things. And it will take some time to realize that it's really in accord with who you really are. Relatively speaking, my transition has been fairly easy. Like I said, I'm a unicorn. I lucked out in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think 5 out of every 7 or 7 out of 10 transgendered people have attempted suicide in the civilian world. And I want to take a moment to divide the civilian transgender community from the military transgender community, because I think there's an important thing we can take away from there. In the military, a transgender person starts out higher up on Maslow's pyramid. They have food, they have shelter, they have employment, they have basic needs met. And they're able to focus on different parts of their transition. When you don't have to worry about being fired for being transgender, when you don't have to worry about having housing because you're transgender, you're able to do a lot more in a lot safer environment. But for the civilian counterparts, of which I'd been one for 5 years, I'd had a 5-year break in service, that's not the case. There are places where you can be fired for being transgender. There are places where you can be denied housing for being transgender, where it's perfectly legal to pay someone less for being transgender. I think that's pretty horrible. And when someone is dealing with their core identity. And the concept that they aren't who society wanted them to be. And you heap onto that, it's not legalized discrimination, but it's, in some ways it is. I have friends from Tennessee who moved out here because in part because they were tired of not being people. And I think that's the hardest thing, is because when you make the decision, you accept the fact that in the majority of this country, you aren't a person anymore. You don't have protections, you don't have status as a person does. And when you couple that with losing family, as some people do, and friends, as some people do, and potentially your job, it puts a lot of pressure on you. I wasn't at risk of losing my job because Washington State makes it illegal to fire because you're transgender. But even I was under pressure to conform to a standard to dress properly, to look perfectly female, and I wasn't allowed to transition at work. I was either male or female. And when you start adding those pressures in, it gets rough. And if you've had past trauma with the HRT, it gets even rougher. So you end up with people who, for all intents and purposes, should be stable like myself, who have kind of everything squared away, attempting suicide. And then you're put into a mental health care environment that may not understand that you're transgender, and if you're on HRT, that the emotions that you're displaying are not congruent with your birth gender, but are congruent with the gender you're transitioning to. So decisions are made and medications are given out, and it can cause things to spiral. It took about 3 months for people to realize that I shouldn't be on SSRIs, because even though I was displaying depressive natures and I did have trauma, that they were only increasing the issues because of the HRT and because of how I was processing stuff. And for someone who's in that position, who going forward, that's a possibility, I would say that finding someone you can lean on, someone who can support you, even if it's just one person, makes all the difference in the world. So, as I said, I ended up suicidal. Not the proudest moment in my day, and it was, I didn't even start that evening out thinking I was going to commit suicide. I started that evening out wanting to feel emotion. And I can't say it's the PTSD. I can't say it's how I've necessarily been treated as a veteran. I can't say it's being transgender or the HRT, because it isn't any one of those things, but it's all of those things. And a lot of people inside the transgender community have emotional trauma. They have there's more than just what's on the surface. And like I said, the HRT was the scariest thing because it brought that to the surface. I lost my emotional controls. And I had, between October and January, 3 documented suicide attempts. I think the 2 things that really got me through that was I had several friends, but I had one who was very involved. She took time off work, and her father was visiting, and she's a single parent, and she told her dad, "I need you to watch Benjamin. I have to help Gabby." And if she hadn't been there to help me through that, to help me find help, really, and if I hadn't been able to advocate for myself, I probably wouldn't be here. And I know the self-advocation is very hard. It's very, very difficult when you're dealing with providers who have their own views, who treat via cookie cutter, not because they're transphobic or they're homophobic or anything, but because let's face it, the mental health care system in this country is overworked. The other thing that I would say is you need a provider, at least one who you can trust. My PCM took to calling me, telling me she was going to call me, and calling me. And we would talk, not necessarily just about how life was going. She's not much older than I am. Actually, she's a bit younger than I am, but she's a resident, and she took time out of her life as a general practice medical resident to care for me. And Dr. Young, he's the only provider I have a cell phone number to, and he was very upfront. Call me any time of the day or night that you need to. And having that support on the medical side it validated that what I was going through was real, and that I wasn't being seen as just another suicidal vet, another suicidal transgendered woman, that I was being seen as a person. And when you add in the help my friend gave me, the support she gave me, the hospital visits, and the crashing at my place until she knew that everything was all right. I mean, that's what got me through it.
So what were you, I've never really asked anybody this, but like when you're in that situation, what was it that you were feeling?
The first time, I genuinely wanted to feel. I had just told a service member who was in my old unit the story behind some of the photos that were hung on the wall, some of the soldiers that we lost in Iraq. They were very close to me, and she'd made a comment that normally when she hears stories like that, the people are in tears, because she works also at an ER at a VA, And I was just so calm and emotionless. And there was something about that that just drove it home. And that I just described the death of a person that I loved with no emotion, and I couldn't feel emotion, and I wanted to feel emotion. And I sat down at my computer and I started to write out what I wanted to feel, the difficulty I had in talking to people. And the next thing I knew, I'd taken 8 oxycodone with 2 shots of vodka, and this journal entry had turned into a suicide note. Now, once I got through all of that, again, the mental health care system in our country, in my opinion, is overworked. I was stabilized-ish. And then I was released into the world, and I was having difficulty just managing day to day. I kept being told that it was all right, that everything was all right, but once I started to spiral down, I needed to be able to catch myself, and I couldn't catch myself. I kept grasping, and nothing was, I wasn't able to hold on to anything, which is what ended up driving me to the VA. Unfortunately, the first thing they did was put me on medication. And the turmoil in turning down sleeping pills and anti-anxiety pills, not because I don't have trouble sleeping, but because I knew that I wasn't in a state that those were safe with me. I didn't realize that the SSRIs weren't safe either. I enjoyed the very, very narrow side effect of becoming increasingly suicidal while on antidepressants. And the second time I was still spiraling, and I hadn't caught myself, and there were some concerns, and I ended up in the hospital on the 10th anniversary of my friend's death in Iraq. And I knew where I was going. I was afraid of being outside of the hospital on that day.
So do you think it's a combination of you know, losing friends and your transitioning and the hormones?
Yeah, no, definitely. It was very much a combination of unstable hormones, because my hormones weren't balanced. My hormones weren't balanced until August, September of this year, over a year later. The trauma, the SSRIs, feeling like I was losing everything at once, and in retrospect, as I was described, an angsty 12-year-old girl going through puberty. Once I was able to convince mental health care providers that they should stop looking at me as male because I was transitioning, they started drawing these correlations. Yeah, I'm probably a little depressive. Yeah, I have PTSD. But most of my symptoms were linked back to that HRT, were linked back to what you see in girls going through puberty. And once we could establish that, it became so much easier to deal with everything else.
Well, that's really interesting. So for all the fathers, you got to be really careful when your kids are going through, your girls are going through puberty. So the last thing I wanted to ask you was just what would you say to someone, I mean, maybe I've already asked this before and I'm repeating myself, but what would you say to someone that's going through this and having a hard time? Like, what would be your last words for someone that's watching that is going through your thing? What do you want to say to them?
Well, it's not magic. I can't guarantee that it will get better. But I do know that the day you give up on yourself, that's the day you lost, and you can't give up on yourself. It's not a popular decision to transition. It's not something that most of our society accepts, and it's going to lead to a lot of lonely nights. But having that feeling, being treated as the gender that you really are, and not in a mocking way, not in a derogatory way, but because people recognize that you are a man or a woman, and that's in congruence with what you recognize in yourself. It makes it all worth it. So I would say, don't give up hope on yourself. And even though I can't guarantee that it would ever get better, it feels like it does.
We would love to have you subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're the Beauty Docs. We're going to be coming up with new interesting videos showing you a glimpse into our lives in plastic surgery. Click the following elements or annotations shown here to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to learn about our award-winning theory on beauty that helps us get you the best results, to see a new video showing you a glimpse of plastic surgery in 60 seconds, or to view our main introductory video for our practice. You can also scroll down below for other helpful links. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.